For more than 1.5 centuries, the inhabitants of northern Mesopotamia witnessed drastic changes in political command, state organization, and the exercise of power. In that time, a group of rulers managed to dominate unprecedentedly extensive regions, transforming local ties into a structure that depended on their direct control. The name of that elite, Akkadians, came to designate not only those who shared language and origin, but also officials and leaders united by political loyalties. Amidst wars, decrees, and displacements, that network consolidated as a central authority. How did that power develop until it became the first empire of the region? Banquet of power, the purchase that founded a new nobility. Around the year 2260 BC, in the lands of Akkad, a group of 964 people was summoned to a royal meal. Although the atmosphere seemed festive, there was not much to celebrate in reality. Some had received new attire and valuable ornaments. Others could proudly show off newly acquired teams of mules along with carts and tools handed over as part of the deal. A few had even secured enough money to purchase spacious homes and fully furnish them. The food served was of high quality, possibly fire-cooked pork and delicacies normally reserved for the palaces. However, all these guests had just transferred to Manishtusu, son of Sargon, the properties inherited from their families. A part of those lands bordered lands already in the hands of the monarch, which made it difficult to reject the proposed agreement. If the usual productivity of more fertile areas in the south is considered, the value paid for the plots was barely equivalent to 2 estimated annual harvests. Under those conditions, a farmer would hardly voluntarily give up their fields. According to the bill of sale document, a total of 49 witnesses designated as Akkadians validated the operation. Among them were scribes, government officials, high-ranking soldiers, religious leaders and bureaucrats, all of them under the direct backing of the king. The evident purpose of the acquisition was to ensure that these individuals received fertile land as compensation for their loyalty and work in favor of the sovereign. Many of the beneficiaries were part of a new dominant class that barely represented the second generation of its lineage. Several descended from former rulers and high officials from relevant urban centers. That new elite had assumed an Akkadian identity, leaving behind their places of origin to join the state structure under the monarch's orders, ready to be deployed to any region between the Upper Sea and the Lower Sea. Recent events had been turbulent and marked by violence. Rimush, Manishtusu's younger brother, was assassinated after inheriting the throne from his father Sargon, victim of a court plot. Given this situation, the new ruler required a group of unconditional allies both in the administration and in the army. The purchase operation included 3,430 hectares intended for cultivation. If that surface had been distributed equally among the 49 signatory witnesses of the agreement, each one would have received a portion of approximately 70 hectares. That figure is much higher than the standard lot of 6 hectares usually granted to administrators settled a little further south, although it resembles the extensions of 62 hectares granted to privileged servants in Girsu, a provincial seat of Sumer during the Akkadian administration. The king gave such importance to this action that he ordered it to be engraved on black diorite, a hard stone brought from Malgan in the Gulf via river transport. Numerous exotic articles arrived in the capital along with that cargo. The resulting monument was a large obelisk, a form that had not been used in Mesopotamia until that moment. The piece was installed inside a temple, perhaps in Akkad or possibly in Marad, a city where his grandson Lipit Ili would later rebuild a sanctuary dedicated to the local deity. The obelisk registered the payments made, the presents delivered by the king, the exchanged lands with their exact location, the names of those who sold them, and the list of the 49 witnesses who were also beneficiaries. With this considerable investment, Sargon's eldest son sought to consolidate his territorial power, reward his close followers, and, as the Akkadians themselves expressed, strengthen the foundations of his authority. The birth of an empire, the wars that made Sargon eternal. In his commemorative inscriptions, Sargon claimed to have emerged triumphant in 34 military campaigns. Although his early years may have included defeats, his successes began in Sumer, where he defeated and captured Lugal-Zagesi, monarch of Uruk, who had extended his authority over many Sumerian cities and reached the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and the so-called cedar forest in Lebanon. In addition to Uruk, Sargon defeated Umma, Lagash and Ur, thus managing to dominate the entire region of Sumer up to the headwaters of the Gulf. He also undertook an offensive in Elam and Susa. Few later dynasties would manage to govern that area protected by the desert, capable of wearing down even the strongest armies. His campaign in Elam was probably reflected in a large diorite stele found there, where he is represented alongside his retinue. Years later, someone tried to destroy that stone by hitting it with hammers and trying to fragment it into pieces. Sargon's victories extended towards Sabum and Awan, and he even defeated forces coming from Marhashi, perhaps the area near Kerman, famous in Mesopotamia for its precious stones, alabaster vessels and luxury items. Towards the north and west, he obtained the surrender of Mari, which controlled the center of the Euphrates, and Ebla, south of Aleppo, an important competitor of Mari. According to his own texts, the god Dagon, lord of the clouds, granted him the upper countries, that is, the territories and populations of the upper Euphrates and areas beyond. His armies could even penetrate the heart of Anatolia, known by the Akkadians as the land of the cedars and the mountains covered with snow, which they called of silver. All this comes from the records he left about his achievements. Furthermore, Sargon wanted to be remembered for 3 great achievements: placing Akkadian governors in the conquered provinces, attracting international trade to his capital, Agade, and having enough resources to feed 5,400 active men in his service every day. No previous sovereign had proclaimed anything similar. For future conquerors, his figure became a role model as he forever transformed the idea of what a single warrior king could achieve. His name and his memory remained in the Mesopotamian memory in the same way that Alexander's endured in the Mediterranean world. His history was reinterpreted again and again to adapt to the visions of different eras. In fact, for a Mesopotamian chronicler of Alexander's time, Sargon marked the beginning of empirical human history, while previous monarchs belonged to the realm of mythology, in which gods and people shared the same stories. Although he counted on the favor of Inanna, also known as Ishtar, Sargon lived fully in the real world. With the passage of the centuries, many scribes and scholars of Mesopotamia wished to know more about him. His ancestry remains uncertain, since the inscriptions of Sargon and his descendants do not mention the name of the monarch's father, a custom that would only appear in later times. A royal list compiled half a century or a little more after his death included him among 8 ancient rulers considered to be of non-royal origin, although that assertion may not have a historical basis. Imagination tried to fill the gaps in his biography. A Sumerian tale recounts that, protected from birth, Sargon served as cupbearer to King Ur-Zababa of Kish. The cupbearer was a trusted official responsible for providing and serving food and drink to the monarch and his court. During his service, young Sargon perceived the close presence of the goddess Inanna, but kept silent. The divinity later manifested to him in an unsettling dream, covering him with blood. Upon telling the sovereign, he interpreted that the blood was his own and understood that his servant planned to kill him. He then sent a message to his master blacksmith, ordering him to eliminate Sargon when he arrived at the temple workshop with some bronze cups intended to be melted down. The plan was to throw him into the mold along with the utensils. However, Inanna intervened before he entered the building where they were waiting to lay the trap for him. The goddess stopped him at the entrance and warned him that no man stained with blood could enter a sacred house. There, Sargon ran into the blacksmith Belish Tikal, to whom he handed over the royal cups. The craftsman melted them down and the young man survived. After a few days, Sargon presented himself before Ur-Zababa in his own palace. Upon seeing him alive, the king trembled with fear in his dwelling, understanding that the cupbearer enjoyed divine protection. The meaning of the dream was thus revealed. Inanna had covered him with blood not to condemn him, but to save him. The blacksmith was impressed by the goddess's intervention, and the monarch also upon seeing that Sargon had returned safe and sound. Both understood that the divinity protected him. The idea that Sargon was blessed from birth and favored by Inanna reappeared more than 1,000 years later in an Akkadian text that pretended to be his own childhood account. According to that writing, his mother, a high-ranking priestess, abandoned him as a newborn, making him the first example of the exposed child who later claims his rightful place, a story repeated later with Moses or Cyrus. That woman, capable of giving birth to an heir for the king, would have hidden the son to protect him from possible rivals if the father had died. Although literary works composed in his time about his deeds are not preserved, beyond the poems of his daughter Enheduanna, whom he named High Priestess in Ur, heroic legends in Akkadian were elaborated centuries later during the first half of the second millennium. Some specialists believe that they derive from older epics. Others think that they were original creations of that time. This latter point of view is supported by the fact that the chosen settings are located in the north and west, Assyria, northern Syria, and the Anatolian Plateau, and not in Sumer or Iran, the areas preferred by the authentic texts of the third millennium. In one of those narratives, valor in combat is exalted, and it closes with a challenge. Thus occurs the encounter of the brave. Tomorrow Akkad will go to the fight. Strength will be celebrated. The ranks will move again and again. 2 women will give birth bathed in their own blood. Where are the true companions who only observe? Only the coward will remain on the sidelines. Then Sargon announced to his troops, "If any king wishes to equal me, let him march where I have arrived." With the passage of time, Sargon's name continued to appear in the texts of Mesopotamian kings and scribes. His figure was remembered for centuries, until the Hellenistic era, when accounts of his campaigns were still being copied. In the second millennium, stories about his reign circulated from Iran to the Mediterranean. Some reached Hittite lands and also Akhenaten's Egypt, where scribes knew shortened versions of his conquests in Anatolia. The conqueror's heirs, blood and power in Akkad. Sargon died in the year 56 of his reign. Upon succeeding him, Rimush was met with an uprising in Sumer, a territory that had shown open opposition to his father's rule. With a series of violent campaigns, he managed to re-establish Akkadian authority and claimed to have eliminated more than 23,000 enemies in combat and captured the double, probably to execute them as well. He expelled thousands of fighting-capable men from the defeated cities and imposed harsh punishments on them, mass executions or forced labor. A collection of tablets from Umma, one of the rebellious cities, shows that citizens and slaves were forced into heavy labor in Iran, perhaps carving stone. Rimush also met resistance in Babylon, but quickly quelled it with identical brutality to that applied in Sumer. After subduing the rebellious cities, Rimush ordered the confiscation of more than 130,000 hectares of fertile land near Lagash and Umma. These plots were handed over to his loyal soldiers and officials, which created a new group of owners unconnected to the ancient families and temples of Sumer. For the local inhabitants, seeing the Akkadian administrators distribute their fields was a total defeat. The victors established their new domains where the region's peasants had previously worked. With battle experience already gained, Rimush then resumed Sargon's offensive in Elam. An alliance led by the ruler of Mahashi, who had extended his authority westward into Elamite territory, sought to curb Akkad's influence in Iran and the Gulf. The Akkadian troops defeated the coalition and captured its leaders, re-subduing Elam and Susiana. The booty obtained was enormous. In the sanctuary of Nippur alone, Rimush deposited 30 pounds of gold, 3,600 of copper, and 300 slaves. Stone bowls, vessels, shells, maces, and other objects with his name were placed in temples throughout the country, with examples found in Assur, Kish, Nippur, Sippar, Ur, Shuruppak, Tutub, and even in the Kabul area. Rimush also proudly recorded that his artisans had molded a sculpture of him in tin, a very scarce metal in Mesopotamia. With this, he anticipated other despots who would later boast of their technical achievements. That image was placed in front of the god Enlil in Nippur. In the inscription, Rimush made it clear that he saw himself as one more among the gods, as if saying, "I too am on their level." It was a quite direct way of placing himself at the same rank as the deities, something that his nephew Naram Sin would also do later. A couple of generations later, a palace official who wanted to pay him homage took the name of Ili Rimush, which translates as "Rimush is my god." His immediate successors, Manishtusu and Naram Sin, maintained the custom of publishing exact casualty figures in their campaigns, something unprecedented in Mesopotamia, either before or after. Rimush even swore before Enlil in Nippur that his numbers were accurate. Later, legends about Naram Sin inverted these statistics to show fantastic losses of the Akkadian army. Rimush died at the hands of his own courtiers. According to Mesopotamian chronicles, they used the cylinder seals they carried with them as a weapon to commit the crime. There was no trial or punishment. The succession passed immediately to his brother Manishtusu. After such an agitated reign, Manishtusu ascended to power, seeking to secure his position. His brother had reigned at least 9 years, although the inscriptions in Nippur stop earlier, leaving doubts about the last times prior to his death. Was there a civil war? The new monarch explained his access by merely saying that Enlil had called him to the throne. Manishtusu continued the military actions where his brother had left them. His inscriptions relate that he defeated Anshan and Shirihum, territories of Iran located east of Susa, and that he vanquished 32 cities beyond the sea, that is, on the coast of the Gulf. Thanks to these campaigns, he gained access to diorite, a rare stone in Mesopotamian sculpture until then, and used during and after his reign for royal images, especially funerary ones. There were no private dedications in that material, so it appears to have been reserved for royalty. Since only the standard inscription of his campaigns is preserved, and his statues appear in diverse areas of the empire, it can be deduced that most of his reign passed in peace and was aimed at consolidating monarchical power. Although direct texts are missing, other evidence indicates that he had activity in Assyria and in the Kabur region. The later king Shamshi-Adad attributes to Manishtusu the construction of the Temple of Ishtar in Nineveh and mentions inscriptions that the Akkadian would have placed there. In Assur, a spearhead dedicated by a servant of his and a headless statue that could belong to his time were found. His reign seems to coincide with an early phase of Akkadian presence in Nagar. A later forgery from Sipar, probably based on an authentic commemoration, was written to justify donations to the Shamash temple of that city. Everything indicates that his rule was more significant than the current remains and the Mesopotamian historical tradition show. After 15 years in power, according to later memory, Manishtusu was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, leaving the throne to his eldest son, Naram-Sin, who had already received military commands during his life. The Great Mesopotamian Rebellion, the empire that turned against its creator. Naram-Sin governed for at least 37 years. His name appears on tablets, reliefs, and inscriptions scattered throughout Mesopotamia. The sources from his time, although fragmented, mention numerous military campaigns and construction projects. In many of them, he is presented as a strong king, determined to maintain control over the lands conquered by his grandfather. In a general count of his conquests, Naram-Sin declared that his power extended from Marhashi in the east to the cedar forest, probably in the West Amanus or Lebanon mountains, from the Mediterranean coast to the lands beyond the sea, perhaps the territory of Oman, an assertion supported by the administrative documents preserved from his time. The few records of individual expeditions mention an offensive against the Lulubi, peoples of the northern Zagros, and another on Simurum, a region located beyond the Tigris or on the Iranian plateau. In present-day Armenia, the king followed the course of the Tigris to its origin. He also advanced along the Kabur River and crossed the passes to the high areas, even reaching the sources of the Euphrates. Naram-Sin also claimed to have been the first sovereign to subdue Ebla, south of Aleppo, a city of which Sargon had only said that it served him. He was also the first to boast about his hunts. Unlike his predecessor, he did not leave details about the administration of his vast domain, although the abundant archives of the period show military presence in Susa and also in Syria, where Akkadian buildings and mass-produced clay vessels were found that seemed to correspond to his reign. While the cities of Sumer organized armies to face the Akkadians in the open field, several Syrian cities chose to reinforce their walls and deliver tributes. In a later text, Naram-Sin is represented attacking a fortified city and the enemy ruler enclosed in his palace. In the campaign against Armanum, he managed to cross 3 lines of defense. A school copy of the inscription mentions that the outer walls measured 20, 30, and 44 cubits, while the distance from the river to the fortress was 404. The most notable episode of his reign was a rebellion that arose within Mesopotamia, in Kish and in Uruk, where the citizens proclaimed new kings in opposition to Sargon's heir. Ifur-Kish was elevated in Kish and Amar-Girid in Uruk. The main threat came from Kish, not only because of its proximity to the capital, but because Ifur-Kish had joined forces with several nearby cities, including Borsippa, Kutha, Dilbat, Eresh, Sipar, and Kazalu, in addition to Amorite groups possibly from the Jebel Bishri area. The Akkadian domination in northern Babylonia was deeply unpopular. In an inscription, Naram-Sin recounted that upon learning of the Kish rebellion, he closed the gates of Agade and prayed to the god Shamash. He recalled that his family had liberated Kish in the past, and that he himself had restored the title of King of Kish. However, the inhabitants had revolted. After the invocation, he gathered his troops and marched to battle. He defeated the soldiers of Kish and their allies, captured several chiefs, whose names he recorded, and followed Kish to his city. There he was victorious again. According to his account, around 2,500 defenders died in the assault, and the city was flooded after diverting the course of the Euphrates. Meanwhile, Amargirid of Uruk had gained the support of several important Sumerian cities, including Adab, Isin, Lagash, Nippur, Shuruppak, and Umma, in addition to populations from the Gulf area, which shows the general rejection of the Akkadian power in the south. He even sent messages to the rulers of the upper Euphrates and Assyria, asking them to join, although most did not respond. After winning in Kish, Naram-Sin advanced along the Tigris to the north, and then turned west, following the Euphrates, to punish the Amorites that Amargirid had recruited after that defeat. The two armies met. Naram-Sin defeated them and captured Amargirid. Then he attacked Uruk, and as before in Kish, flooded the city. His offensive against the Sumerian coalition continued with incursions on the localities of the Gulf, whose spoils he offered in temples of the region. From the perspective of Akkad, the capital saw itself surrounded by enemies in all directions, but the monarch managed to defend it again and again. In a single year, according to his inscriptions, he had to mobilize the troops of Akkad in 9 different campaigns throughout Mesopotamia. In a statue base that represented a protective spirit, possibly located in a temple dedicated to his cult, Naram-Sin recounted what happened. When the 4 regions of the world rose up against him at once, by the favor of Ishtar he obtained victory in 9 battles and captured the kings who had revolted. For having saved his city, the inhabitants of Akkad asked that he be divinized along with the great gods, with Ishtar in Eanna, with Enlil in Nippur, with Dagon in Tutul, with Ninhursag in Kesh, with Enki in Eridu, with Sin in Ur, with Shamash in Sippar, and with Nergal in Kutha, erecting a temple for him in Agade. Thus the warrior Naram-Sin came to be among the main deities. However, later Mesopotamian literature gave a completely different reading to these facts. Already at the beginning of the 2nd millennium, a supposed inscription attributed to Naram-Sin circulated that combined authentic fragments with invented names of enemies and disproportionate figures. Each later version added increasingly exaggerated episodes. In these narratives, the king suffered enormous defeats. The number 9, taken from his authentic victories, appeared transformed into repeated rebellions. 9 times they rose against me, 9 times I left them free. According to those accounts, 360,000 of his soldiers perished in continuous battles, leaving the monarch exhausted, dejected, and his kingdom devastated. The enemy armies gradually became unreal beings, neither of flesh nor of blood. In a version found in Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, the god of wisdom Ii pronounces the fate of that horde: that they not eat food, that they not smell the aroma of beer, that they drink only water, that they wander without rest, and that, even lying down, they not find sleep. In the 1st millennium, the story about Naram-Sin circulated in the form of an apocryphal inscription that warned the kings of the future. It told that his enemies were presented as monstrous beings, similar to those created by Tiamat in the Babylonian myths. The narrative mentioned creatures with human features and crowheads, guided by 7 kings and an army of hundreds of thousands of combatants who devastated the lands between Anatolia and the Gulf. Naram-Sin, according to that account, tested their nature by having one of them wounded, and, after consulting the omens, decided to fight. He first sent 90,000 soldiers, and then another 60,000. But none returned. The text concluded with a warning addressed to the rulers: remain behind the walls, act with prudence, and avoid violence even in the face of provocation. With the passage of the centuries, these versions moved so far away from the known facts that they resembled the fantastic stories about Alexander. The once victorious king now appeared as a vanquished ruler who imitated his own inscriptions. This change responded to the desire for balance that marked the Mesopotamian tradition. Show Sargon as the founder of a great kingdom, and Naram-Sin as his fallen descendant, remembering that no power or city remains forever. It also reflected a form of consolation in the face of loss. The Temple of Gold, Naram-Sin and the reconstruction of sacred power. As was fitting for the cult of the protective goddess of his dynasty, Naram-Sin dedicated special attention to the temples of Ishtar throughout the Mesopotamian territory. He ordered work on her sanctuary in Nineveh, in Assyria, where his father had previously intervened, and also in Zabala within Sumer, using cedar logs from Mount Amanus. He commissioned works in Adab and possibly in Babylon, in addition to those he promoted in the capital, Akkad. In Ur, he began projects in the temple dedicated to Sin, where he named his daughter Enmanana as supreme priestess, successor to his aunt Enheduanna. The monarch claimed to enjoy the preference of the god Enlil. Crowned in Nippur, he attributed his arrival to the throne and his continuous victories to the will of that deity, as indicated by his inscriptions issued in Sumer. In Nippur, he presented the defeated chiefs of the coalitions that had confronted him in chains, including Amar-Girid of Uruk, in the same way that Sargon had exhibited Lugal-Zagezi. Rimush's offerings to the Ekur temple, dedicated to Enlil, were surpassed by Naram-Sin's decision to rebuild it completely with a splendid imperial style, conceived as a sign of the greatness of his power. By chance, several administrative tablets were preserved that recorded the reconstruction of the Enlil temple. They are the only documents of that type for that period. They show the daily work of Naram-Sin's workers under the direction of his son, Shar-Kali-Shari. Large quantities of metals such as bronze, copper, silver and gold are recorded. The number of workers was high. One tablet mentions 77 carpenters with 7 chiefs, 86 goldsmiths with 6 foremen, 10 sculptors under 1 supervisor, and 54 carvers led by 3 managers, in addition to other artisans. Many arrived from other cities and were housed by the locals. Thanks to these texts, some of the ornaments of the new Ekur temple can be imagined. At the main entrance, 2 large protective copper figures with gold-covered faces that supported standards were placed. There were also 4 golden bison on each side of the portal on the outer wall. The access was guarded by 2 winged copper dragons with open teeth and gold-covered mouths. The doors had copper nails with gilded heads and were closed with heavy bolts in the shape of dragons or water buffalo. In the interior sanctuaries, the frames were flanked by small guardian divinities with standards and equally gilded faces. Inside the sacred buildings, the cult objects included 100 sun discs and 100 crescent moons, totaling approximately 29 kilograms of gold. The silver implements of a single sanctuary amounted to nearly 200 kilograms. There were also votive statues of Akkadian nobles covered with sheets of gold. The Ekur must have offered an impressive spectacle. When Naram-Sin died, the works were still not finished, but his son Shar-Kali-Shari continued the labor and probably managed to complete it. However, a later Sumerian poem known as the Curse of Akkad gave a very different interpretation to the reconstruction of the Ekur. According to the text, Naram-Sin had dreamed of the loss of splendor of his city and, seeking to regain the favor of Enlil, destroyed the ancient sanctuary with the intention of building a new one. When writing became government, the Akkadian administrative apparatus, Naram-Sin governed a vast territory that demanded constant control. Although the Akkadian kings presented themselves as warriors and hunters, they knew that power also depended on land and livestock. This is demonstrated by the lands confiscated by Rimush and the purchases made by Manishtusu. Sargon had begun appointing governors in the conquered areas, thus creating a network of officials who only existed thanks to the direct support of the king. That network was not only military, it also handled civilian tasks. This is how an administration began to form that did not depend on the temples or the ancient cities, but on the central power in the hands of the sovereign. After the king, in the military hierarchy were the generals and the subordinate officers. The main civilian position was the shaperum, equivalent to a steward or administrator of the royal household. This position had no precedent in Sumer, so the Akkadian term and function were adopted by the Sumerians during that time. After the steward, the highest position was that of the official who kept the accounts of the palace lands. The control of the fields that fed the king's servants fell to him. Governors and officers received plots of land as part of their post and could expand those properties by paying the royal treasury. The records for each area were kept by the chief scribe and his group of surveyors. When the irrigation season arrived, these scribes would tour the fields and record how much land remained under water. With this data, they calculated the expected harvest and what was to be delivered both to the monarch and to the men in charge of cultivating for him. Sumer and Akkad had very different ways of organizing work in the countryside. In the northern lands, the Akkadians preferred to work large extensions and distribute them according to a general calculation of what could be cultivated. In the south, the Sumerians took advantage of smaller areas and counted each plot separately before adding them up. In Sumer, they also continued to use their own measurements for lands and harvests, which differed according to each city. The work there was in the hands of groups controlled by the temples or offices, where each person had their function. That structure did not exist in Akkad. To attract the peasants, they offered land, benefits and protection to those who accepted living under the direct authority of the king or his men. The Akkadian administrators brought their own management methods to Sumer and the conquered territories such as Susa. They introduced a unified standard for measuring the portion of grain subject to state control, using the measure of Akkad. If the product was weighed according to local scales upon leaving the field, it had to be converted to the Akkadian unit when being processed, stored or delivered to the royal officials. It was the first known attempt to impose a common standard on Sumer when control reached a certain level of formality. They also sought to standardize the systems of weight and liquid measures throughout the empire. The Akkadian administrators used mathematical models to estimate agricultural productivity, for example, the surface area that one single ploughing team could work. Such calculations were applied both in Sumer and in their own provinces, although the local centers could preserve their traditional forms of internal record-keeping. During the reign of Naram-Sin, the way of writing and keeping records also changed. Previously, the tablets were rounded, with one flat side and one curved side, and their size varied according to use. Each city had its own writing style and way of keeping accounts. Over time, rectangular or square tablets appeared for longer records, while the rounded ones were used for simple agreements or vouchers. They were thinner and easier to stack. That change helped to quickly identify the type of text and marked a new step in the organization of the administrative work of the empire. At the same time, a new official writing style was adopted throughout the empire. It was characterized by broad, spaced and precise strokes. High-ranking documents were written with a formal and elegant stroke, while common records used a more practical version. Anyone who aspired to a position had to learn this Akkadian script, and there is evidence that ancient scribes retrained their techniques to adapt to the new model. For unknown reasons, these innovations caused an even more drastic change, the rotation of the cuneiform signs 90 degrees to the left, preserving the ancient orientation only on seals and monuments. Spelling was modified to facilitate the reading of Akkadian, and the set of Sumerian signs used to write Akkadian words was updated. Everything suggests a systematic effort at standardization in the middle and upper levels of administration. Officials expected that well-written records and clear accounting summaries would be produced in each locality, ready to be reviewed by the royal inspector. This official appears to have acted as an independent auditor, traveling from one place to another to verify that the king's interests were correctly fulfilled. There was no obligation to use a specific language. In Sumer, Sumerian was preferred, although written with the new Akkadian script. In Akkad, Akkadian was used. On occasions, both languages appeared on the same tablet, a sign that the administration functioned in a bilingual manner. Sealing practices also changed. In Sumer, the use of the seal was reserved for the parts of the tablet without text, while during the Akkadian period it was applied to the reverse of letters of introduction, contracts and documents of relevance, adding visual authority to the record. During the time of Naram-Sin, a flat type of sealed bulla became widespread, perhaps in response to the extended use of personal seals among high Akkadian officials, many of whom showed scenes of combat. Naram-Sin's government was key to changing the way accounts were kept and records were stored. From then on, that model continued to be used throughout the third millennium. Daughters of the God King, marriages, priesthoods and family power. Naram-Sin had at least 10 sons to whom he granted important functions within his domain. The heir, Shah-Kali-Shari, accompanied his father on military campaigns in the same way that Naram-Sin had done alongside Sargon, and received the responsibility of supervising the reconstruction of the Akor temple in Nippur. Another son, Nabi-ul-Mash, served as governor in Tutub within Akkad. There are seals and sealings with the names of other sons and their servants, which indicates that they also held relevant positions in the administration or in the cult. Naram-Sin appointed 3 of his daughters to hold important religious positions. Tutanabshum was designated as the supreme priestess of the god Enlil in Nippur, and this fact was so notable that it gave its name to a year, indicating that her election was decided by divination. Enmenana, another of his daughters, assumed the principal priesthood of the moon god in Ur, as her great-aunt Enheduanna had done before her. The third, Shumshani, was consecrated as the high priestess of the sun god in Sippar. These 3 temples were among the 8 that Naram-Sin mentioned in the inscription, where he proclaimed himself divine, which suggests that other close members of his family were also placed in the 5 remaining sanctuaries. This created a network of family ties that connected him directly with the principal deities. Due to how his ties with Ishtar are described in the texts, it is probable that he himself fulfilled a similar role in the Ulmash temple in Agade, a name that several of his sons and daughters also carried. Naram-Sin also followed the custom already documented in the pre-Akkad era in Ebla of establishing marriages for dynastic purposes. Sealings with the name of his daughter Taramagade have been found in the city of Urkesh, which strongly suggests that she was given in marriage to a member of the royal family of that place. The seal of Taramagade includes only her name and that of her father, with no reference to her new title of queen or princess in Urkesh. Her name, translated as "she loves Agade," whether imposed at birth or adopted upon marriage, functioned as a constant reminder of her fidelity to the Akkadian house. In contrast, the wife born in Mari of King Shulgi of Ur took the name Taram Uram, which means "she loves Ur," reflecting her loyalty to the new kingdom more than to her origin. Like her sister Taram Agade, another daughter of Naram-Sin, named Simat Ulmash, whose name means pride of Ulmash, seems to have retained or adopted that designation when she married a prince or ruler of Mari. In that city, a copper tray engraved only with her name and filiation was found, along with a similar inscribed bowl belonging to her sister Shumshani. Given that Shumshani served as the principal priestess of the sun god in Sippar, it is inferred that in Mari there was also a temple dedicated to Shamash within the complex of buildings from the Akkadian period known as the Anonymous Temples. It is possible that some marriage agreements promoted by Naram-Sin with the so-called Lords of the Highland influenced the decision of those chiefs to remain aloof during the so-called Great Rebellion, despite the pleas of the king of Uruk, according to Naram-Sin's own inscriptions. Likewise, he may have formalized an alliance with Susiana through marriage to a local princess, and one of his sons would have married a woman of royal lineage from Marhashi. In this way, the political and familial network of the empire was reinforced through carefully established personal ties. The last central control, Shaka-Lishari in the crisis of the empire. The successor to Naram-Sin was his son Shaka-Lishari, who inherited a consolidated empire after 3 generations of expansion. His ascent began with his enthronement in Nippur and a ceremonial tour of the Sumerian cities, where he was received with festivities and great banquets. He appointed General Puzur Ishtar as the person responsible for the works in the Ekur temple of Nippur, and promoted the reconstruction of sanctuaries in Babylon, dedicated to Ishtar and Ilaba, the tutelary deities of the dynasty. Babylon, barely mentioned before, began to gain relevance during this period, perhaps taking advantage of the decline of Kish after his father's repressive campaigns. Shaka-Lishari also acquired lands, possibly as a mechanism to reward his allies and secure his power base. In the following years, the sovereign had to face growing challenges. He launched successful campaigns against the Amorites in the area of Jebel Bishri and led his armies to the headwaters of the Tigris and the Euphrates. He repeated the route of the Cedars of the Amanus, just as Naram-Sin had done. Some of these expeditions may have been carried out during his father's reign and later attributed entirely to him. He also faced an Elamite incursion into Babylon. At the same time, new enemies emerged, the Gutians originating from the center of the Zagros, whom Akkadian texts describe as primitive plunderers, although in reality they had organized troops and centralized leadership. Unlike Sargon and Naram-Sin, Shaka-Lishari did not leave a lasting mark on Mesopotamian tradition. His inscriptions are scarce, and it is not clear whether he managed to maintain imperial cohesion until his death, which occurred after about 25 years of reign. In any case, political unity disintegrated shortly after, which was celebrated by cities that had been under Akkadian domination. That power vacuum allowed the emergence of new figures. Puzur-Mamar, a high official, proclaimed himself King of Lagash, a title that broke with local tradition and controlled the domains of the Akkadian administration in that area. Ili-Ishmani, for his part, seized Susa. The Gutians descended from the mountains into the Diyala Valley and then entered Sumer, settling in Umma and threatening centers like Adab and Uruk. They also proclaimed themselves kings. In Agade, several brief sovereigns succeeded each other, as the Sumerian king list reflects with an eloquent formula: who was king, who was not king. One of them, Irgiji, sent a missive to Lagash claiming the authority to administer justice in the name of Agade. The Sumerian texts composed after the fall of the empire present this break as divine punishment. One of the best-known poems narrates how the god Enlil sent the Gutians to take revenge on Naram-Sin. It describes them as a lawless human species with the mind of a dog and the body of an ape. They arrived like a plague, ravaging the fields like uncontrolled herds. Agade fell into despair. Hunger led citizens to fight for crumbs, and the soil was stained with blood without distinction of guilty or innocent. It was desired that those who previously ate in banquets would end up sleeping outdoors, and that those who enjoyed first fruits would chew the rope of their own roof. Even the doors of houses were used as food. Outside the religious framework, some archaeological investigations point to environmental causes. In the Khabur Basin, many settlements were abandoned suddenly towards the end of the 3rd millennium. The lack of rain would have forced migrations to areas with more stable water resources. That same period coincides with an exceptional atmospheric phenomenon, an explosion caused by a meteorite that set vegetation on fire, raised a cloud of dust, and left the region sterile. Erosion rendered the land infertile. For the survivors, the world seemed to have been emptied. Although the archaeological evidence in Khabur is consistent, it cannot be stated that this region was essential for the sustenance of the empire, which depended mainly on Sumer for cereal supply. The loss of the Khabur must have been a significant blow, but not determining. Furthermore, important centers such as Naga and Urkesh do not present clear signs of the disaster, and their dating is ambiguous. In the south, a decrease in the flow of the Euphrates would have reduced the cultivable areas, while the north suffered desertification processes, especially affecting the lands recently incorporated by Akkadian policy and given to the elites. It is probable that those dominant classes suffered the effects of the drought first. If local mechanisms of self-government had also been weakened, peripheral communities could rebel more easily in contexts of crisis. In total, ecological factors, demographic collapse and human displacements seem to have played an indirect but decisive role in the fall of the imperial system. According to Norman Yoffe, the very success of the Akkadian model would have undermined the ancient urban structures. Forced integration and foreign campaigns would have drained resources without managing to incorporate local elites into the new order. This process would have generated accumulated tensions that exploded when central control ceased. Paradoxically, foreign campaigns and the subsequent collapse are the elements that most interested ancient chroniclers and modern scholars. In the midst of the disorder, a new ruler, Dudu, settled in Agade and reigned for 21 years. It is unknown whether he descended from Sargon's family. His authority extended at least as far as Adab. During his government, he attacked Umma and Lagash, and possibly led a campaign against Elam. No further details are preserved. It is possible that Sumer escaped his control with the resurgence of Uruk. His son Shu-Durul governed 15 years in Babylon and the Diyala Valley, but lost territory to Puzur in Shushinak, the king of Elam. The history of the Akkadian Empire formally concludes with the death of Shu-Durul. The buried legacy, what remained between the Tigris and the mountains. The term Akkad referred simultaneously to a region, a city, and a people whose appearance changed the course of Mesopotamian history, despite the fact that their origin still presents several unknowns. Like the swamps of Latium or the coasts of Byzantium, places that no one would have foreseen as future imperial centers, the arid and open plains of Akkad did not foreshadow the central function they would come to play. Today, the precise location of that city remains undefined with certainty. It is estimated that it was located to the east of the Tigris, near its confluence with the Diyala. As the Akkadian power expanded, the term Akkad came to encompass the entire alluvial strip from Nippur to Sippar by the Euphrates, and by the Tigris at least up to the Adhaim. The climate presented two distinct seasons. Between May and October, the summer was dry and suffocating, with cracked soil and warm winds that dragged dust. In contrast, the winter brought cold, persistent rains and muddy terrain. A brief and temperate spring served as a transition. Even in the times of the Akkadian Empire, the region was less populated than the fertile areas further south, such as those near Nippur and Uruk. The inhabitants called themselves Akkadians, and that name encompassed both their language and their customs. With the government of Sargon and his descendants, Akkadian also began to mean a political and cultural affiliation proper to the governing elites. This change recalls the later use of Ottoman, which went from designating a tribal group to defining a power structure with common values and education, regardless of ethnic origin. Subsequently, Akkadian was the term used to refer to the languages spoken in Babylon and Assyria, although it would have been more accurate to call them Babylonian or Assyrian. The name Akkad appears in cuneiform writing with variants such as Akkadu, Agede or Agati, and its ultimate meaning is still unknown. Conclusive details about the exact location of Agade, the capital city founded by Sargon, are not known. It is most probable that it was situated north of the confluence between the Diyala and the Tigris, perhaps in the vicinity of Samarra or further up, next to the Adheim. The use of a syllabic script for its name, instead of ancient signs, suggests that it was a recent foundation in times before the empire's apogee. The earliest references to the city date back to a few generations before Sargon. Although today a distinction is made between Agade as a city and Akkad as a region, at the time both were called in the same way. About the origins of the Akkadian people, no tradition is preserved, unlike the Assyrians who mentioned nomadic ancestors. The analysis of the language reveals that the Akkadians were the most oriental Semitic group, settled between the Zagros and the Mediterranean coast. Semitic designates a linguistic family with its own characteristics. For a long time it was erroneously assumed that these peoples were nomads opposed to agriculture or urban life, an idea that distorted their historical perception. However, there is no evidence that they were more itinerant than other Mesopotamian peoples, nor that they rejected cities. In reality, pastoral, agricultural and urban life systems coexisted within the same space, something that differentiated them from Sumer, where cultivation and cities limited nomadism. It is possible that Semitic communities had settled in Akkad since remote times, combining pastoralism with mixed crops, perhaps since the 7th millennium. Their first recognized political center was Kish, towards the beginning of the 3rd millennium, which would explain why the historical memory of the north concentrated more on that city than on Agade. The inhabitants of Kish perhaps did not even identify themselves as Akkadians. During the rise of the empire, cities such as Kish, Mari and Aleppo were interconnected by land and river routes, sharing the same culture. There were cultivated areas in the valleys of the Euphrates, the Balik and the Kabur, and extensive steppes traversed by shepherds. It was easy to travel between Akkad and Syria, either by the plain, the river or the foothills. Accessing Iran was more difficult. It could be achieved through the valleys of the Diyala and the Zab, or by skirting mountains up to Elam. Sumer in the south was reached by land or by water. The unity of the landscape, the abundance of resources, and the ease of communication favored the appearance of expansive states that looked towards the west once their borders were stabilized. In that context, Agade shared a strategic position with other future cities, such as Babylon, Ctesiphon, Seleucia, Baghdad or Samarra, a node of routes towards Syria, Anatolia, Iran, the Gulf and the heart of Mesopotamia. 5 centuries after Sargon, the scribes of the time of Hammurabi still considered Agade a symbolic capital. Although it declined towards the end of the 3rd millennium, its central cult was moved to Sippar and possibly to Babylon. It was repopulated in the 7th century before Christ, when Esarhaddon, a Syrian king, reconstructed the temple of Ishtar there, which remained active until Persian times. The last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, claimed to have found the remains of the original sanctuary dedicated to the goddess in that place. The sources mention a sanctuary called Ulmash, dedicated to Ishtar, although its precise function remains uncertain. Naram Sin claimed to maintain a special bond with that goddess and promoted that temple in a prominent way. 2 of his sons and 1 daughter bore the name of the divinity, thus strengthening that bond. The Akkadians were not the only occupants of the territory. To the south lived the Sumerians, and the contact between both groups generated a reciprocal cultural influence. The Sumerian language and writing system were adapted by the Akkadians to express their language through a mixture of phonetic signs and logograms. Thus, ancient knowledge was transmitted, even that which no longer had a direct use, but continued to be essential in the formation of the scribes. Some personal names that do not have a clear meaning in Sumerian or Akkadian, such as Buzuzu or Ititi, could reflect the presence of previous populations integrated into the empire. One of Sargon's most important generals, Ititi, bore a name of that type, as did an ancient ruler of Assur, perhaps the same person. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the Gutians, coming from the eastern mountains, occupied part of the ancient territory and assumed royal titles, imitating their predecessors. Their land was known for its slaves and herds, and its name ended up being synonymous with Oriental invaders. Another group were the Lulubi, shepherds of present-day Iraqi Kurdistan, whom Naram Sin fought in campaigns commemorated in reliefs such as the famous Stele of Victory. The Akkadians also related to peoples from Simurum, Awan and Hamazi in the north and east, with Elam, Marhashi, Dilmun, Magan and Meluha in the south, and with the Amorites towards the west. In the northern regions lived the Hurrians, whose language was different from Akkadian and Sumerian, but who adopted the cuneiform script and would later have a key role in Western Asia. Two Hurrian branches are known, one to the east of the Tigris, towards the lower Zab and the Iranian plateau, and another western one in the middle Euphrates, the Kabur and the southeast of Anatolia, from where they founded kingdoms that expanded towards the north and the Mediterranean. Naram Sin arranged a marriage for one of his daughters with a ruler of that last region. North of Akkad, especially east of the Tigris, was the region of Subir or Subatu, which in later times was associated with Assyria. Although the Assyrians themselves recognized that term in Babylonian texts, they located it further east in Iranian lands, known for the beauty of their captives. In Mari, already in the second millennium, Hurrian was called Subarian language, which indicates the antiquity of the concept. Subatu represented, in short, a diffuse north from the Sumerian perspective, but tangible for those who inhabited it. Akkad was a land without defined limits, inhabited by diverse groups and traditions. Akkadian was imposed as the language of the elites, although its cultural identity was inseparable from the Sumerian roots. Both ancient documents and current studies highlight the strategic location and the advantages of its capital, situated between fertile fields, trade routes, and resource-rich mountains. Although the poetic sources ignore the ethnic variety of its people, they do portray a rich, active city consecrated to Ishtar, present in its temples and celebrations.